My name is Helen Carter. I am 116 years old. Most people see me and ask the same question: how are you still alive? They expect me to speak about nutrition, supplements, or some special meal I ate every single day. But if I speak honestly with you, living this many years was never about the food I consumed. It was about what I endured. I was born in 1910. I have witnessed two global wars. I have seen people leave this world much earlier than expected. I have watched technology evolve faster than my own body could adjust. I have buried friends, relatives, my husband, and even one beloved child. Longevity is not only about staying physically alive, it is about staying mentally resilient when everything around you transforms. When I was a small girl, life was simple yet difficult. We did not have very much money. I remember winters when the house felt colder than it should have been. I remember my mother stitching clothes carefully by hand. There was no conversation about emotions back then. You worked, you endured, you continued forward. But even as a child, I felt emotions deeply. I worried very easily. I would lie awake during the night thinking about things that had not even happened yet. Nobody called it anxiety. They called it a vivid imagination, but it felt heavy inside me. As I became older, I learned to carry that heaviness silently. I married fairly young. My husband Thomas was gentle, reliable, and incredibly patient. We created a life side by side during difficult years. We survived financial struggles. We survived long periods of uncertainty. There were days when we did not know how we would manage, but somehow we always found a way. But life is not gentle forever. When I was 39, I lost my mother. That was the first moment I truly understood deep grief. It felt like someone had pulled the ground away beneath my feet. And yet I still had children to care for. I still carried daily responsibilities. So I swallowed my tears and kept moving forward. That slowly became a pattern in my life. Feel deeply, but continue walking. Years went by. Children became grown adults. The world continued to change rapidly. But the hardest moment of my life arrived later. I lost my husband after nearly 50 years together. One morning I woke up and he was simply gone. The silence inside the house was louder than any storm I had ever heard. People visited for several weeks. They brought meals. They offered kind words and sympathy. Then slowly they returned to their own routines, and I remained alone in a home full of memories. I will tell you something very honest now. There were nights when I did not want to wake up the next day, not because I wished to die, but because I simply did not know how to continue living. That is something people rarely mention when they talk about long life. Living many years means watching countless goodbyes. It means carrying memories that sometimes feel heavier than your body. But here is what helped me survive. I refused to let grief become my entire identity. I allowed myself to cry openly. I allowed myself to miss him deeply. But I also forced myself to keep small daily routines. I made my bed every morning. I watered my little plants. I walked slowly to the mailbox outside even when I did not feel like moving. Those small habits saved my life. At 91, people began calling me a strong woman, but real strength was never loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was waking up each morning and choosing to continue even when nothing felt exciting anymore. At 100, I sometimes felt almost invisible. The world moved much faster. Conversations changed. Technology began to confuse me often. I felt like a visitor in a time that no longer belonged to me. That feeling can disturb the mind deeply, the sense of being left behind. But instead of fighting the modern world, I became curious about it. I asked many questions. I learned things slowly and patiently. I accepted that I did not need to understand everything in order to still belong here. Now at 116, I wake up every morning with one simple thought. I am still alive today for a reason. My body is far weaker now. My steps have become much slower. My hands tremble slightly when I hold things, but my mind stays surprisingly clear because I stopped fighting against life. The truth about living so long is not avoiding pain. It is learning how to carry it carefully without allowing it to crush your spirit. I forgave many people from my past. I forgave my own mistakes. I stopped replaying old arguments inside my mind. I stopped punishing myself endlessly for errors made many decades ago. If you truly want to live long emotionally, not just physically, you must release bitterness. Bitterness will age your heart faster than time ever could. At 116, I understand something very clearly now. You cannot control how many years you live, but you can control how tightly you hold on to anger, regret, and fear. And when you loosen your grip, even a very heavy life begins to feel lighter. I am not here because I was fearless. I am here because I kept choosing life every morning. One more day, one more breath, one more chance. And sometimes that is all a person needs. When I look back at my long life, there is one period that tested me deeply more than any other, my 40s and 50s. Many people believe a long life means peaceful years stacked neatly together. But that is not true at all. There were seasons when I felt like I was barely holding on. The world felt unstable and uncertain. There was fear everywhere. War changed entire families. News traveled slowly back then, but when it finally arrived, it carried enormous weight. I remember evenings sitting beside the radio, holding my breath while listening carefully for updates. Even when my own home was safe, my heart never truly rested. Living through uncertain times changes the way your mind works. You begin expecting bad news first. You prepare your emotions before anything even happens. That kind of constant tension stays inside your body. At that time, I did not realize it, but I was living in a state of quiet worry. My children were growing older. My husband, Thomas, worked very long hours. I tried to stay strong for everyone. I cooked, cleaned, managed the household, and smiled when necessary. But inside, I was extremely tired. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally drained. There were mornings when I woke up with a heavy feeling I could not explain clearly. Nothing was technically wrong, but everything felt fragile and uncertain. I would look at my family sitting at the breakfast table and suddenly feel a deep fear of losing them. That fear stayed with me throughout the entire day. Nobody talked about mental health in those years. If you felt overwhelmed, people simply called it stress, and then you continued working. So I kept going forward. Then life tested me in a way I had never expected. One of my children became seriously sick. Hospitals slowly became part of our daily routine. I learned how to sit for long hours in waiting rooms that smelled of medicine and worry. I learned how to smile gently at my child while feeling terrified inside. There is a special kind of helpless feeling that appears when you cannot protect your child from suffering. Those months aged me more than the previous 10 years combined. At night, when everyone else was sleeping, I would sit alone in the quiet kitchen. I stared at the wall and asked myself how much more I could possibly carry. I was not angry at God. I was not angry at the world around me. I was simply emotionally exhausted. Eventually, my child recovered fully, but something inside me changed forever. I realize that strength is not endless. Even the strongest person has limits. In my early 50s, I experienced what I now understand was deep emotional burnout. I stopped enjoying simple things. I avoided social gatherings. I felt disconnected even when standing in crowded rooms. I smiled out of habit, not from real happiness. My husband Thomas noticed the change before I did. One evening, he told me quietly that I looked like I was somewhere far away. He was right. I was lost inside my own thoughts. That conversation forced me to admit something I had never admitted before. I was not okay. Saying those words out loud felt strange, almost embarrassing, but also unexpectedly relieving. I did not go to professional therapy. That was quite uncommon in those years, but I began doing something very small, yet powerful. I started writing in a notebook. Every evening, I wrote down everything I felt, not what I believed I should feel, but what was truly inside me. Fear, exhaustion, frustration, gratitude, and love. Writing slowly became my quiet form of therapy. It taught me something very important. Emotions lose much of their power when you face them directly. Around that same period, I started walking outside alone every morning, just 10 or 15 minutes. No destination, just slow movement. I began noticing simple details: birds in the trees, warm sunlight, gentle wind, small reminders that life continues moving even when your mind feels stuck. That routine slowly brought me back to myself. By my late 50s, I felt stronger again. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because I understood my mind much better. I stopped pretending I was unbreakable. I accepted that a long life requires emotional care. People now see someone who lived over a century and assume resilience came naturally, but it did not. It was built during the years when I felt weakest. Those difficult decades taught me something that guided the rest of my life. Pain is temporary, but avoiding it makes it permanent. When you avoid grief, it grows larger. When you avoid fear, it multiplies quietly. But when you sit with those feelings, breathe through them, and allow them space, they slowly soften. I am still here today because I stopped running from my emotions in my 50s. When I entered my 60s, I believed I had already survived the most difficult parts of life. I had endured uncertainty, illness, emotional fatigue, and deep fear. I thought the years ahead would become much calmer. In some ways, they did, but they also brought a different challenge, one I never expected. It was the slow feeling of becoming invisible. My children were grown adults by then. They had their own families, their own responsibilities, and their own busy lives. My husband Thomas and I finally had quiet evenings together. At first, it felt peaceful and gentle. We would sit outside on the porch, drink tea, and talk about old memories. But gradually, I noticed something shifting inside me. For decades, I had been needed every single day: mother, wife, caregiver, organizer, and problem solver. My identity had been built around helping others. When those daily demands slowly disappeared, I felt lost. I remember waking up one morning and realizing that no one urgently needed me anymore. There were no school lunches to prepare, no emergencies to manage, and no constant noise in the house. Silence can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like emptiness. That was the first time I experienced what I now call an identity crisis. If I was no longer the center of a busy household, who exactly was I now? Many people in their 60s experience this quietly. They smile and say they are enjoying retirement, but inside they are searching for purpose. I was no different. I tried filling the space with activities, church groups, community meetings, and volunteering. Some of it helped, but some of it felt forced. Eventually, I understood something important. Purpose cannot be borrowed from others, it must be chosen personally. Around that same period, I slowly began losing close friends. It started very gradually, one funeral, then another, and eventually two in the same year. Every loss felt like another chapter closing forever. With each goodbye, I felt the world becoming smaller. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from outliving people who shared your past. Younger generations cannot fully understand the stories of your youth. They listen politely, but they were never there. Sometimes I would sit quietly and think that there were fewer and fewer people who remembered who I once used to be. That realization can disturb the mind deeply. It makes you question your place in the present world. In my 70s, my body also began reminding me that time was moving forward. My knees began to hurt. Often, my energy slowly decreased. Tasks that once felt simple and easy required careful planning. I had to accept help in small ways. Accepting help was harder than I expected. I had spent most of my life supporting others, being the strong one and the reliable person. Now I had to let my children carry groceries for me. I had to allow them to make decisions for me sometimes. Sometimes it challenged my pride deeply, but resisting change would have made me bitter. So instead, I practiced acceptance. I reminded myself that strength at 70 looks very different than strength at 40. Then came the greatest loss of that period: losing my husband. After nearly 5 decades together, I woke up one day and the man who had shared my entire life was gone. The house felt unfamiliar and quiet without his footsteps. His chair remained empty. His voice no longer filled the rooms. Grief at that age feels especially heavy because you understand that time is limited. You know you may never build something like that again. For many months, I lived inside a quiet fog. I kept his belongings exactly where they were. I avoided touching his clothes or personal items. It felt as if moving them would make the loss suddenly real. But eventually, I realized something important and painful. I was building a museum of memories instead of living a continuing life. One afternoon, I sat quietly on his side of the bed. I cried openly and allowed myself to feel the grief completely. Then I did something very small but symbolic. I moved his pillow. That simple moment marked a quiet decision inside me. I would carry his memory in my heart, but I would not stop living. My late 70s slowly became a period of rebuilding. I created new daily routines. I spoke more openly about my feelings. I allowed myself to grieve without shame. I learned to live alone without seeing it as abandonment. Those years taught me something very important. Loneliness is not always about being physically alone. It is about feeling disconnected from purpose. So I created a new purpose. I began mentoring younger women in my neighborhood. I shared my stories and experiences. I listened much more than I spoke. Eventually, I realized that my value was not in doing everything. My value was in sharing wisdom, and slowly the emptiness softened. When I entered my 80s, something changed in the way I experienced time. In your 40s, you plan many years ahead. In your 60s, you begin planning more carefully. But in your 80s, you wake up knowing every year is truly a gift. You stop assuming there will be endless tomorrows waiting ahead. After my husband Thomas passed away, the house felt larger than ever before. Rooms echoed with silence. Even the smallest sounds suddenly seemed much louder. At night, the quiet felt almost physical, heavy in the air. Loneliness at 80 is not dramatic. It is subtle and quiet. It appears in simple, everyday moments, pouring one cup of tea instead of two, setting the table for one person, watching television without someone beside you to comment on what is happening. There were evenings when I would sit quietly in my favorite chair and feel a deep wave of sadness pass through me. Not panic, not despair, simply the clear awareness that most of my life was already behind me. That awareness can disturb the mind deeply if you allow it. I began thinking about death more openly, not with fear, but with a kind of curiosity. I would quietly ask myself if I was ready for the end. And the honest answer at first was no. I carried small regrets, things I wished I had said more often, trips I had postponed too long, apologies I had delayed, old misunderstandings that had never been fully resolved. When you are 80, regret feels heavier because time feels shorter. So I made a clear decision. I would not carry regret into my final decades. I began calling people I had not spoken with in years. I apologized when I needed to. I told my children I loved them far more often than they expected. I wrote letters to my grandchildren, not about achievements, but about mistakes and lessons. That process slowly lightened something inside me. Around 85, my body slowed down noticeably. My steps became careful and measured. I moved with greater intention. Doctor visits became a regular routine. Every appointment reminded me that I was living on borrowed time, and strangely, that awareness made me feel calmer. When you stop pretending you are permanent, you begin appreciating small things much more deeply. Sunlight through the window, the sound of birds, a warm bowl of soup, a grandchild's laughter. But I will not pretend it was easy every day. There were mornings when I woke up and felt a sudden wave of fear. What if today is the day everything ends? What if my heart stops while I am alone at home? That kind of thought can spiral quickly if you allow it. So I trained my mind gently and patiently. When fear appeared, I did not fight against it. I would say quietly to myself, "Today, I am alive." Then I focused on what I could control, breathing slowly, moving carefully, remaining present in the moment. Fear loses power when you stop arguing with it. By the time I reached 90, many of my closest friends had passed away. Conversations became shorter because there were fewer people who remembered the earliest chapters of my life. That loneliness could have consumed me completely. Instead, I chose connection in new ways. Instead, I chose to connect with people differently. I listen more carefully to younger generations. I ask them about their struggles and worries. I realized something very important. Although the world had changed dramatically, human emotions had not changed. Fear, love, insecurity, hope, they remain the same in every generation. Understanding that truth helped me feel less isolated. There is another reality about living into your 90s. Your world becomes physically smaller. You may not travel very far anymore. You may not move as quickly as before, but your inner world can remain rich and meaningful if you allow it. I began reflecting more deeply about the patterns of my life. I thought about the times I worried unnecessarily, the moments I held anger too long, the times I underestimated my own strength. Living this long teaches you that most things we panic about never truly matter. At 92, I stopped fearing death the way I once did. It no longer felt like an enemy waiting in the dark. Instead, it felt like a natural closing chapter of a long book. I did not rush toward it, but I also stopped running away from it. Mental survival at this age requires acceptance, accepting slower days, accepting fewer plans, accepting that your body will not always cooperate. But acceptance does not mean giving up. Even now, I still make my bed. I dress properly every morning. I sit upright and speak clearly. These small actions remind my mind that I am still participating in life. Participation is the true key. You do not survive into your hundreds by avoiding fear. You survive by walking beside it without letting it control your life. When I reached 95, people began looking at me very differently. Before that age, I was simply an elderly woman. But after 95, I became something rare in their eyes. People would say with surprise, "You are still here," as if I had done something extraordinary. But living beyond 95 is not glamorous. It is quiet, it is slow, and sometimes it is lonely in ways I never expected. By that age, I had already outlived most friends. Even some younger people I once comforted were gone. Birthdays stopped feeling like celebrations. Instead, they felt like milestones I crossed alone. There is a strange feeling when you realize you are the oldest person in the room almost everywhere you go. You begin carrying entire generations of memories inside your mind. At family gatherings, I would sit and watch children playing, remembering that I had once been the young one running across the yard. Time begins to feel circular at that age. The past feels closer than yesterday, but with that closeness comes a quiet, emotional weight. Sometimes I asked myself why I was still here. It was not a question of despair. It was a question about meaning. When you outlive your partner, your siblings, and most of your peers, you must redefine your purpose again. My body had slowed dramatically by then. My steps were small and careful. My hearing was weaker. My hands trembled slightly when I held a cup. I depended on others more than ever before, and dependence can disturb the mind deeply if pride is still strong. There were moments I felt like a burden, moments when I apologized too often for needing help. But over time, I understood something important. Needing help does not reduce your value. Allowing others to care for you actually gives them a chance to show love. So I stopped apologizing for my age. Instead, I began thanking people for their kindness. Around the age of 97, I started sharing my life story more openly, not because I believed my life was extraordinary, but because stories create connections between people. When younger people sat beside me, I did not lecture them. I spoke honestly about my fears, mistakes, and heartbreaks. And I noticed something unexpected. They listened very carefully, not simply because I was 97, but because honesty connects across generations. By the time I passed 100, birthdays became more symbolic. People took photographs and asked questions. They wanted to know my secret to longevity. They expected something mysterious or magical, but there was never any magic. There were many mornings, even after 100, when I woke up tired of waking, not depressed, simply tired of the long journey. Living that long requires patience with limitations. Your physical world becomes much smaller. You may not travel far. You may not see as clearly. You may not hear every word in a conversation, but your inner world can still grow deeper. I began practicing gratitude more intentionally. Not the kind that sounds poetic, but the kind that feels grounding. Gratitude for breathing without pain. Gratitude for sunlight in the morning. Gratitude for another conversation with family. Those simple habits slowly strengthened my mind. At 102, I lost one of my closest lifelong friends. That loss felt different. It felt like the final page of a chapter closing forever. We had shared memories that no one else understood. After her funeral, I sat quietly and allowed the loneliness fully. Then I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not let grief make my final years bitter. Bitterness is heavy, and at 100, you cannot carry heavy emotions. So I practiced letting go of old grudges, letting go of self blame, letting go of anger that no longer belonged in the present. I realized that long life is not about adding years, it is about removing emotional weight. The lighter your heart becomes, the easier it is to continue. By the age of 105, my days were simple and structured. Wake up, wash slowly, sit by the window, speak with family, rest, reflect. Routine became stability for my mind. People often ask whether I'm afraid of death. The truth is that after 105, fear begins to change shape. It softens. You no longer see death as a thief in the dark. You begin seeing it as part of life's rhythm. What frightened me more was the thought of not appreciating the days I still had. So I focused on being present, not rushing, not resisting, simply present. That presence carried me beyond 105. And now at 117, people still ask me the same question. What is the secret? There is no secret food, no magical routine. The truth is very simple. I survived because I refused to let bitterness remain. I survived because I released anger before it poisoned me. I survived because I allowed myself to grieve without letting grief define me. I survived because I forgave myself. And most importantly, I survived because every single morning, even on the hardest days, I chose to wake up again. One more day, one more breath, one more chance to love. At 117, I am not fearless. I am not perfect. I am not untouched by pain, but I am peaceful. And that peace is the greatest achievement of my long life. If you are listening to me now, no matter your age, remember this. Do not wait until you are 100 to forgive. Do not wait until you are 110 to release anger. Do not wait until you are 117 to choose peace. Live lightly, love deeply, and when the time finally comes, let go gently. That is how I lived 117 years.